They didn't know his name when he arrived, only that he was smaller than the others, quiet, and already marked by the guards as a problem waiting to happen. Within days, the man who controlled the cell block lay broken, not from rage, not from brutality, but from a brief, almost unremarkable exchange no one fully understood at the time. Years later, witnesses would still struggle to explain what they saw. They only agreed on one thing. After that moment, the prison was never the same, and neither was the idea of strength. The prison was designed to be orderly, concrete geometry, timetables, rules posted on walls no one read anymore. But order did not come from structure, it came from reputation. Inside the cell block, violence wasn't constant, it was selective, and that was what made it effective. Men learned quickly that survival did not depend on strength alone, but on understanding when strength would be used against them. The loud learned restraint, the quiet learned invisibility. Every morning followed the same rhythm: count, movement, work details, meals eaten fast, eyes lowered. Nothing dramatic happened most days, and yet everyone lived with the expectation that something could happen at any moment. That expectation governed behavior more reliably than guards ever could. There was a hierarchy, though no one named it aloud. At the top were those who had proven, publicly, that they could end another man's sense of safety without hesitation. They didn't need to fight often. Memory did the work for them. Below them were the compliant. Men who understood the rules instinctively. They gave space. They avoided eye contact. They learned routes through the block that minimized friction. At the bottom were the new arrivals. They arrived with civilian habits still intact. Standing too straight, speaking too quickly, reacting too openly. The system corrected them swiftly. Correction did not always look like a beating. Sometimes it was a tray knocked to the floor, a shoulder check in a narrow corridor, a stare held half a second too long, small acts, calibrated, designed to teach limits. The guards were aware of this order. They did not create it, but they did not interrupt it either. Intervention came only when blood made paperwork unavoidable. Everything else was considered self-regulation. In this environment, violence was not emotional. It was administrative. Men who lashed out without calculation did not last. They attracted attention, consequences, isolation. True control belonged to those who understood restraint, those who could threaten without moving, punish without spectacle. This was the ecosystem. Bruce Lee entered. Not a battlefield, but a pressure chamber. One that rewarded predictability and punished misunderstanding. Most inmates adapted by becoming smaller versions of themselves. Fewer words, fewer gestures, less presence. The prison did not break men, all at once. It compressed them, slowly, until only what was essential remained. And into that compressed space, a new figure would soon step. Not defiant, not submissive, just observant. The system had rules. It always did. And systems, no matter how brutal, have blind spots. Bruce Lee did not announce himself when he arrived. No posture meant to signal confidence. No attempt to appear invisible either. He moved as someone accustomed to rooms where attention followed naturally, and therefore had learned not to chase it. The intake process treated him like everyone else. Measurements, paperwork, a uniform that erased distinctions. The system did not care about reputations from the outside. Inside, history had to be earned again. What stood out was not his size. He was smaller than most men in the block, but the absence of hesitation in his movements. He did not rush, yet he was never in the way. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it was brief, practical, and complete. Men noticed this quickly. In places like this, stillness is read as either weakness or warning. It takes time to know which. The prison's informal authority had already taken notice before Bruce knew there was such a thing. The man everyone deferred to did not need to patrol. Others carried his presence for him. Conversation shifted when his name was mentioned. Space opened around him without instruction. He was not loud. He did not posture. He sat where he chose and remained there. That was enough. When Bruce entered the common area for the first time, the room did what it always did with newcomers. It tested the air around him. Conversations paused, resumed, adjusted. Eyes tracked movement without appearing to. The authority figure did not look up immediately. That delay was deliberate. Power rarely hurries. Bruce took a seat at a bench near the wall. He placed his hands on the table, not clenched, not loose, just resting. His gaze moved through the room without fixing on anyone. That, too, was noticed. The challenger, though he would never have used that word, finally lifted his eyes. The assessment was quick. Height, reach, weight, age, no obvious threat. What disrupted the calculation was subtler. Bruce did not look away. There was no stare down, no tension pushed forward. Just mutual recognition that something in the usual pattern had shifted slightly. Authority thrives on predictability, on knowing how others will react before they do. Bruce offered no such clarity. The first test did not come that day. It rarely does. Instead, the room absorbed him, and in absorbing him, began to feel a quiet imbalance, like weight added to one side of a structure that had stood unchanged for years. No challenge was spoken. No warning was given, but both men understood something had begun. Not a conflict of strength, a conflict of certainty, and certainty in places like this is never resolved quickly. Tension in confined places does not announce itself. It accumulates. Trapped. The third day, Bruce Lee's presence had been fully registered. Not as a disturbance, but as an anomaly. He followed routines without friction, ate when food was served, spoke when spoken to, asked nothing that invited attention, and yet attention gathered anyway. Men began adjusting how they moved around him, not stepping aside, just accounting for him, like furniture that hadn't been there before. Solid, unavoidable, quietly reshaping pathways. The authority figure watched this from a distance. Power, when secure, allows patience. He let others approach first. Small tests arrived, disguised as accidents. A shoulder brushing too close. A tray nudged on the table. A question asked with just enough edge to invite a response. Bruce responded to none of it in the expected way. When bumped, he adjusted his stance rather than his expression. When spoken to, he answered without apology and without challenge. His voice never rose, but it never softened either. That unsettled people more than aggression would have. Aggression fits a script. Calm does not. Words spread, not loudly, but sideways, in glances, in pauses, mid-sentence, in how quickly conversations ended when Bruce entered a space. The authority figure finally chose to intervene. It happened in the open, not dramatic, not ceremonial. During recreation, when the room was full and idle, when witnesses were guaranteed, he approached without haste, no entourage, no threats delivered through others, just a slow crossing of space that naturally cleared as he moved. Bruce noticed early. He shifted his weight, barely perceptible. His hands left the bench and hung at his sides. His breathing remained unchanged. The man stopped a few feet away, close enough to impose presence, far enough to appear reasonable. He spoke first, not an insult. Not yet, a statement about territory, about how things worked, about order. Bruce listened fully before responding. He did not interrupt. When he answered, it was brief and precise. Not disagreement, clarification. Witnesses would later struggle to recall the exact words. What they remembered was the silence that followed. It lasted longer than comfort allows, in Dai. That silence, Something irreversible occurred. The authority figure realized the encounter had not gone as planned, not because he was challenged, but because he was unacknowledged. Bruce had not submitted. But he had not opposed either. He had treated the moment as informational. That was the fracture. The room felt it immediately, like a structure settling, after a crack forms deep inside. From that moment on, the confrontation was no longer optional. It would happen. Not because Bruce sought it, but because authority, once questioned, even quietly, must reassert itself. And everyone knew it would. Not be loud, it would be short, and it would leave the room changed. There was no announcement, no circle formed in advance, no raised voices to summon attention. The moment began the way decisive moments often do, mid-routine, half-noticed, almost ordinary. The authority figure chose the time carefully. When supervision was present but distant, when boredom had dulled alertness, when enough witnesses were nearby to carry the story forward without embellishment. He did not posture. He stepped close and placed a hand where it did not belong, not violently, but deliberately, a test that could no longer be ignored without consequence. Bruce looked at the hand, then he looked at the man. Witnesses later described his face as unchanged, not calm in the theatrical sense, simply neutral, as if he were observing an object rather than a threat. What happened next was not fast in the way fights are fast. It was efficient. Bruce did not wind up. He did not step back to gather momentum. He shifted his weight forward, barely visible, and removed the hand as one might remove an obstacle from a path. The movement was small enough that some thought it had failed. Then the man's structure disappeared, not thrown, not struck down, disconnected. His balance collapsed inward, as if something essential had been turned off. His knees bent before his mind understood why. The sound he made was not pain, but surprise, air leaving the body without permission. Bruce stayed close the entire time. No pursuit, no chase. He allowed gravity to finish the work he had already decided was over. From contact to stillness, less than 8 seconds passed. There was no follow-up. Bruce stepped back immediately, hands open, shoulders relaxed. He did not look at the fallen man again. That was what unsettled the witnesses most. There was no triumph to react to, no aggression to punish, only a result. The authority figure remained on the ground, conscious but altered. His breath came shallow. His eyes searched faces that no longer mirrored certainty. Around them the room had gone silent, not shocked silence, evaluative silence. Men were recalculating, not fearfully, but honestly. Rewriting internal maps of strength and hierarchy, supervision. Arrived late enough to miss the mechanics and early enough to feel the aftermath. No one spoke over anyone else. There were no accusations offered with confidence. Bruce answered questions simply. He did not justify. He did not explain. He described only what had occurred in the most minimal terms possible. The man was taken away. He returned days later quieter, moving differently, sitting where he had never sat before, and no one asked Bruce anything after that. Because nothing needed clarification. The demonstration had not been violent, but it had been complete. The change did not arrive dramatically. There was no announcement, no visible transfer of power, no moment where the room collectively acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, the adjustment unfolded. In small behaviors, subtle, almost invisible, unless one knew what to watch for. The authority figure returned after several days. Physically, he looked intact. No bandages, no limp, no visible marks that could justify what had happened. And yet the men who had once oriented themselves around his presence noticed immediately that something essential was missing. He moved more carefully now, not cautiously in a fearful way, but deliberately, as if his body had learned a new limit. His mind could not unlearn. He avoided crowded spaces. He chose seats near walls. He spoke less, And when he did, his voice carried none of its former expectation of obedience. He did not look for Bruce, and Bruce did not look for him. That mutual absence of attention mattered. It told everyone else that the exchange was complete. That nothing remained unresolved, no rematch pending, no dominance to reinforce. Bruce's routine did not change. He woke when he always had. He trained alone or not at all. He spoke only when spoken to, and sometimes not even then. If anything, he became less noticeable, as though visibility itself had lost relevance. But the room had reorganized around him. Conversations shifted when he entered, not stopping outright but softening. Challenges that once escalated now dissolved early. Disputes ended with words rather than tests. Men chose distance without being asked to choose it. What unsettled them most was that Bruce never claimed the space that had opened. He did not take the central bench. He did not assume informal leadership. He did not offer instruction. The vacuum remained, and yet no one rushed to fill it, because they had learned something they could not unlearn. They had seen that strength did not need rehearsal. That control did not announce itself. That the most decisive action in the room had been the smallest movement anyone could remember. Over time, the incident became difficult to recount accurately. There were no clear angles, no clean explanations. Those who tried to describe it found themselves gesturing vaguely, resorting to phrases like, "he just touched him," or "it was already over before it started." The absence of spectacle robbed the story of drama, but gave it weight. New arrivals heard versions of it within days, always quietly, always without exaggeration, often ending with the same conclusion. Don't bother him, not because he was dangerous, but because he was precise. Years later, when some of those men spoke of the place, they did not remember the rules or the schedules with clarity. They remembered moments when noise stopped, when confidence dissolved without conflict, when a lesson was delivered without words, and at the center of those memories was not a fight. It was restraint. It was the realization that mastery does not dominate, it concludes. Bruce never spoke of it afterward. There was no record of his account. No attempt to correct the versions that drifted with time. He allowed the silence to stand, because silence, when earned, carries longer than explanation. Years passed before the story found its final shape. By then, the place itself had changed. Walls were repainted, schedules adjusted, faces replaced one another in steady rotation. The men who had been present that day moved on, to other institutions, other lives, or quiet disappearances that left no forwarding address. And yet, something remained. It was not a rule, written or enforced. Not a warning posted or repeated aloud, not even a story told in full. It survived instead as a pause. Those who arrived later sensed it before they heard it. They noticed how certain names were spoken differently, how one corner of the yard was never claimed for long, how challenges sometimes dissolved before they were fully formed, as if the environment itself resisted escalation. When they asked why, the answers were never dramatic. He was here once. That already happened. You missed it. Bruce Lee did not return. There was no follow-up encounter, no formal acknowledgement of what had occurred. His absence became part of the story, not as disappearance, but as completion. He had entered the environment, absorbed its pressure, and left it unchanged on the surface but altered beneath. Those who later trained with him elsewhere never heard the account directly. If they asked about confrontations, he redirected the conversation. If pressed, he reduced the memory to a single observation, offered without emphasis. People show you who they are when silence is involved. He did not clarify. The lesson was not meant to be extracted easily. Over time, the man who had issued the challenge became a footnote. His name faded first, then his reputation. He was remembered not for what he attempted, but for what followed, a narrowing of presence, a retreat from certainty, a recalibration that never quite reversed. He carried the outcome longer than anyone else, because he had learned it internally, without applause, without audience reaction to dilute its impact. Others learned it differently. They learned that authority does not announce itself, that mastery does not rush, that the most decisive moments often appear unimpressive in isolation and irreversible in consequence. They learned that violence, when avoided rather than indulged, leaves fewer traces, but deeper ones. And they learned that some encounters are not meant to be retold accurately, only remembered correctly. Years later, when Bruce Lee's name grew larger than any room could contain, the story surfaced again in fragments, retold by witnesses who had aged into caution, repeated without embellishment, as if exaggeration would weaken it, always the same pattern, a challenge made loudly, a response delivered quietly, an outcome that required no explanation. Those who heard it did not imagine blows or spectacle. They imagined stillness, distance closing without urgency, a moment so brief it resisted replay. And then, nothing. That nothing was the point, because what endured was not dominance or victory or humiliation. What endured was adjustment. The environment adjusted. The people adjusted. The memory adjusted itself into something durable and restrained. In the end, the story did not belong to the one who challenged, or even to the one who responded. It belonged to those who witnessed restraint and never forgot what it felt like to see certainty collapse without force. That is how the place remembered it. Not as a fight, but as the moment noise learned its limit,